Coach Dean Oliver, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for
Good
joining
morning.
us. Good morning. Yeah, you're out in Hawaii living the good life as we just talked about. Nice library, one-way ticket. You told me
Oh yeah,
you're just hanging out in Hawaii until you're like, okay, I'm ready to get back.
I'm writing. I'm working. Hawaii is a good place. I grew up here too, so I got
Yeah.
used to studying hard, working hard, and then playing hard when all that was done.
What are you writing?
Writing book number two, the
Ooh,
follow up to what I did 20 plus years ago in basketball on paper. The
yeah,
second one to highlight the things that have changed. When I did that first book, the data was a tiny subset of what we have now, and
yeah.
we've learned a lot over those last 20 years, not only from new data but from new ways of thinking about the game.
Very cool. And yeah, as we also just touched on before we hit record here, and again, we had Michelle Tafoya was one of our first guests. She was an early impact on me and my sports networking. I was telling you that too, and I'm sure you over the years you've had a lot of students reach out to you. Hey, review my paper. Hey, look at my these cool stats, or handshake you at the MIT Sloan Analytics Conference.
Sure.
Reason I reached out is like you were one of the first up in the high office when you were at the Denver Nuggets to I just sent you a paper, regression analysis on NBA player salaries. You replied. You didn't just say, "Hey, thanks, I'll review." You asked me questions. You said, "Do you think this is good enough?" And it was just out of a cold email. So one, thank you for that and having an early impact on my career. I know you don't always remember those interactions, but they land with people as they kind of progress. But in that time when I reached out to you, I had no idea that you were like the guy that started NBA analytics, or one of the very first
Mhm.
pioneers. So you just mentioned you published the basketball on paper, and what me and Allison talk about a lot in the healthcare world is, um, we've become an unhealthy nation, and a lot of it is due to looking at the wrong metrics, looking at wrong data, and sending people down the wrong path of unnecessary tests that leads to surgeries, that leads to follow-up visits where they don't get to the root cause, or they don't get to anything that actually gets implemented in the system. So we wanted to talk to you today a little bit about your background and how you got into data, basketball and paper, what you're working on would be really cool. And then because you had this unique experience of working in the front office and coaching, and then on the media side, all these different use cases for data that can actually be used by people to make informed decisions or understand the world a little bit better. So
For sure. Yeah,
with that,
that sounds
yeah. So
great.
with that said, like, just talk about how this world of data, like, were you just always a data nerd like myself, where now I'm on the business side in sports, looking at pricing and sponsorship analytics and inventory yield. Um, did you just always have a proclivity to it? Is that how the way you researched and investigated the world to kind of understand a hypothesis or a question you had about something?
I suppose I was a data nerd. I certainly loved sports.
Yeah.
So a lot of what I looked at, I had baseball and basketball and football cards when I was a kid, and I looked at them not only as for the pictures and the stories and the stats on the back. I had ideas for how to create games out of it too. Like, okay, can we create a football? My brother and I created a football game using dice and some of the numbers on the back of the card, but I knew things were missing. I knew it wasn't replicating entirely what the game did. And so I knew I had a brain for math and sports. That's really what I thought about. So the opportunity to learn as much as I could about things that applied to sports is what I cared about. It's like I would go to class and I would think about how it could apply to what I was looking at in basketball cards or football cards or just what I saw on TV.
Yeah, yeah. And then so you kind of got into the data science world, engineering, regression analysis, all this stuff. And
Yep.
you're working in the corporate world, but you're working on this basketball paper that you published around 2002, I believe. Um, how
Yeah.
long? Yeah,
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, how long did that idea live in your head? Who kind of influenced you? And then high level, because I want to get into what you're working on today. Like high level, everyone can look you up, but like high level, what that first basketball paper like really did, and kind of setting this trajectory that's like now, you know,
As I say,
unbelievably. Yeah.
the idea percolated in my head for a long time. I mean, from the time I was a kid, and certainly Bill James in the early '80s, I was able to read his stuff, and I thought about basketball, and you realize how many iterations you go through on trying to imitate what he does in basketball
Yeah.
before you realize, imitating what he does is not going to work.
Yeah.
You have to start fresh. So I
Yeah.
thought about it for probably close to 20 years before I actually sat down and wrote the book. And as you say, I was learning about regression analysis. I was learning a lot of engineering stuff, frankly.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and that engineering work led me to modeling, not just statistical modeling, but engineering modeling. I was doing where do contaminants flow underground, and how do we keep them from getting into our water supply? So
Right.
I had a broad array of things going through my head.
Yeah. I mean, there's a
So can
great,
I just ask, so from my side, you guys are going with big words about data, and I mean, in PT, in certainly in medical research, there's regression analysis, and there's a lot of data points there. Can you just give us me a little background and listeners a little background from the basketball side, like what was the data for, and what were you using it to accomplish?
In my
I'm
mind,
going big picture because that, for me, I can talk joints and
yeah,
muscles all day long.
and that definitely
So,
leads into the high level of the first
yeah.
paper he published.
yeah,
So, yeah.
the first, I mean, fundamentally, I was trying to answer the same questions that I think general managers and coaches are trying to answer. How do we identify the best players, and how do we put them in the best situation to succeed? How to keep them healthy, how to fit them in, their skills in with everyone else. And that just breaks down to a lot of more detailed questions. But fundamentally, that's what I cared about. That's what I heard about when I played basketball, when I played football. Those are the things you think about. How do I know whether a player is any good? You play with them, and you make certain judgments. But what I found is my playing with players and everything was not perfect. How do I get better at that? And so, as I
Yeah.
say, I took math classes and stuff, and I always thought about how can I apply this to what I'm seeing? How can I know whether this player can actually make good jump shots? How can I know whether they're actually getting? How do I know whether they're making the right trade-off when they dribble into the paint and they turn it over sometimes? How often are they doing that and it's hurting more than it's helping by creating good shots for others? And that's what some of the stats were I was learning about that I tried to apply.
Yeah.
Did you have specific ones you were looking at? Obviously, the health nerd here. Did you have specific ones from when you were looking to, acquire somebody or what have you from your talent? Like, did you have certain health metrics or certain things that you were looking at? Like, did they have surgeries or injuries, and what? That's just my interest, clearly. But what did you look at on that
So
side?
it's a great question. I will say that I think when I first got into the league, I had to trust the doctors. Frankly, I had not seen any of the data. The health data was generally very poorly collected, if at all. And so when we heard from the doctors regarding certain players out there, I remember Monte Ellis in, I want to say, the 2005 NBA draft, and hearing that the doctors said that now his knees are they're going to cave out on him and give out on him very, very quickly. And I really had to trust that, but I took notes on that. That was my job in many ways. Can I come up with a better way to track all of this sort of material? And it's 20 years later now, and I think we are in a much better place with tracking medical data for players, at least. And I think some of the studies can be done a lot better. Unfortunately, it has taken that long. And like, how do you grade knee injuries so that it is predictive? I kept track of those grades on those kind of injuries, and I can tell you some of the players that were graded out very poorly ended up having significant careers, like Monte Ellis. But then there were others who graded poorly, who didn't last and really should have because of their talent, but didn't last because of those injuries. So it wasn't particularly accurate. And what ways are there to do that better? I think that's where we are in my mind with the
right. I mean,
on the health side.
You know, in our world, like you know, for a little while there was an FMS score that was used in football and firefighters a little bit more, like a functional movement score, and to just predict like how their injury prediction rate, which, you know, quite frankly, we can't really predict. And to your point, so much, Matt, I think about you talking about like your time at the Bruins, like there's all these stats, but then there's these intangibles. And, you know, and the way I look at the intangibles from the health side is the psychological side, right? Like I deal so much with whether it's chronic pain or ACL injuries, and like that last little bit of confidence back to sport is something that we try to measure versus little, you know, things, but you just, it's very hard to, and it's so individualized and so much an N of one that it's, you know, to that point, hard to predict. So hard to predict.
The N of one is very relevant here because every player, I mean, in our sport, every player has a different level of quality. There are players who are great players, and there are players who are so-so players, and there are players who are just trying to hang on. And whether that injury gives them a chance depends a lot on where they are on that spectrum. If you're a great player, they're going to give you as long as they can because they see that talent. And you can nurse those injuries. Joel Embiid missed a ton of time. Ben Simmons missed a ton of time at the start of his career. But they had the talent, and like, okay, if they hadn't had that talent, they would not have been given that long leash.
And already like a little clout, like they already had like a name, you know, and, you know, thinking about Achilles injuries, you know, how much that affects basketball players, but, you know, Kobe and Durant, and, you know, they'll come back and they'll play and they'll get there. But, you know, somebody else who, again, is an early on that we might not hear about a whole lot is just gone because they're hard to come back from, and they don't have that chip on their shoulder or even be given the chance yet based on their name. So it's very interesting.
And I think the professionals in the sport are very good at rehabbing a lot of this stuff. I mean, to get players back to world-class level is really impressive. But that is doing a different thing than a lot of times what I've been asked to do, is make predictions about it. Making predictions about injury is a whole different thing. And those guys are healing people a lot better than we're making predictions about how bad that's going to be.
And I think that ties into like breaking down again high level quickly on the basketball paper. Like when we're looking at stuff like this, and again, in my world, I'm in the business world where we're selling, you know, sponsorships and naming rights to the groups, and like what's the value of that sign or the value of that logo on the TV. A lot of times it's just brand sentiment, but what you're trying to do with data, and I mean, it's not that you don't know this and you don't need to know regression, is you're trying to minimize all the unknowns, still knowing, like you're trying to just live in that judgment call zone by kind of distilling all the noise and say, here's as much as we know. And now what does that call it? Let's have a question about everything we haven't answered. And hopefully you reduce that stuff down to intangibles, the eye test. If there's a certain test that shows somebody can come back from an ACL and they perform a jump, but you look at them and their gait isn't right, even though they performed the jump, that's that N of one, but you've reduced it down to that unknown. So I think, Dean, that's like a good lead in, like, tell us like that, the basketball paper, because that was like the revolution to John Hollinger and PER ratings and all these advanced stats. The question you were thinking about for 20 years, just kind of high level, the value of possessions, which like our audience isn't going to know, kind of what questions you were answering immediately to like say, all right, this is really setting a new foundation for how we look at the game.
So Basketball on Paper was the first kind of big picture book on basketball. John Hollinger had written some kind of annual books, and there were a couple other people who did some things, but I tried to lay out, that framework. What's the framework for analyzing basketball? And at the team level, it is how many possessions you use in a game. Because just like in baseball, they have 27 outs. to share. Each team has 27 outs in which to win. In basketball, they have 48 minutes, but how they use those 48 minutes varies. You go up and down the court much faster or much slower, but if you're doing that, the other team, you're alternating possessions. So each team is either going to have 105 possessions or they're going to have 95. And that establishes the basis on which guys are scoring points. A guy scoring 30 points for a team that only has 95 possessions in a game is different than a guy scoring 30 on a team that has 105 on a regular basis. And that tempo element is very prominent, and just normalizing player stats and team stats by how many possessions they have up and down the court. That was one of the most fundamental premises of basketball on paper.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that kind of does what level set it to what Bill James did in baseball, where every pitch is like a unique a unique event that you can measure, right? And like every hit or where they ended up is like you can measure those much more concretely in baseball, just the game as is. Where what you did is you had to massage a much more dynamic game and distill it down to a possession. And once you do that, that opened up the floodgates for looking at everything differently.
Yeah, having a structure, and that was the part that I didn't know. And as great as a writer as Bill James was, he set the table for how to do it in baseball, and everybody kind of jumped to what he did in terms of player ratings.
Yeah,
he evaluated players based upon a great structure for baseball.
Yep.
But in basketball, people who were trying to imitate what he did, they just tried to jump to that player rating using his structure, and it was because I sat down and actually documented what was going on in a basketball game. I was writing down what was going on in a possession. Then I moved to a new line. I wrote down what was going on that possession, that the structure emerged for how to analyze basketball, and making that break was pretty important.
It's pretty.
This is really interesting. I'm just thinking, like, of what you're saying, and like new to the data that you're talking about, and just looking at, like, when I'm returning athletes to their sport, I've never asked the question of how does your team play? Like, what is the tempo? Do we start hot? Do we go, do we pick it up? How does that work? Because, I can see in training, we talk a lot about, if you're a basketball player, there's really no use in running 3 miles. You need to be able to accelerate quick and move. You need to be able to accelerate quick and move. So if you don't work that in, you're missing the boat on training. But now, I'm just thinking in my head, with light bulbs going off, is understanding how that team plays and understanding the flow of the game. Are they a 95 possession team or are they a 120 possession team? That's going to make a difference with minutes and short bursts and all of that. So
this is great. This is exactly the conversations that I've had with our trainers, with our medical staff as well, is around that. They want to know more about what the coaches think a player can do and can't do, or should do and shouldn't do. And more of that communication between the different parts of the organization can synchronize the stuff that you do pre-practice with what they're going to do in practice to minimize chances of injury, warming them up in the appropriate way, knowing what their roles are. That sort of coordination, it is vital. And I think that kind of problem, the matching problem between what one person says and what a coach is actually doing, that's a logistical problem, and frankly a difficult analytics problem.
And I love this
your question of n is 1. That is fundamentally true in those situations.
And I loved it because that qualitative stuff you can quantify. Like you said, you were writing this stuff down. I know these pains as somebody who works with a lot of data. Like, if you're not collecting it, you got to start somewhere, and then like you take it to engineers or technology people. Like, hey, can we systematize this and track it? It's very interesting that like the inputs from people can be data that you're really leveraging. I do this on the business side all the time with our sales team when we're budgeting for next year and we're working with all these brands. I just ask the best predictor I've had is asking the sales guys, how do you feel about this client coming back? Like, how do you think, like, we look at all the metrics that they love, how many people they reach, how many advertising impressions they get, all this stuff. And I'm like, how do you feel about like your relationship with that brand and coming back? And like, when they say we can get them up and spend year over year, talking with them, that qualitative piece, I've learned to factor into just the cold hard data look and make a much more robust prediction. So like when you're working with something with injuries where psychology is a part of it, that doctor's information, they're sitting there talking with the player throughout that rehab. So you can probably try and model that in.
I would say that it's hard to model it in because people's own reliability is variable, right? Some people have strong biases. But I think you want to. I agree that you want to. And your story reminds me of one that that I saw when I was with the Denver Nuggets. So I had read over years what generates revenue for a team. The sports economist had done a number of studies, and basically they showed that what generates ticket sales is how much you're winning, not so much the stars. Right. I mean, it seems kind of basic. It's like, well, it's winning. But they did everything they could. Like, well, there's got to be a star factor, and they would look, and there is a little bit of a star factor. So that came from all these sports economists running regressions, doing complex analysis on the data. And then one night I ended up out to dinner with various members of the ticket sales staff, and they ended up talking about kind of the same topic. And they said, it doesn't matter. We've got Carmelo Anthony, we've got Allen Iverson, we've got superstars, but if we're not winning, we can't sell tickets. So they saw it completely from their perspective of trying to sell tickets. It was about, but if we got on a 4-game winning streak, no matter who was around, it made it a lot easier to sell those tickets. So that's where it perfectly aligned.
It perfectly aligns. So when you introduce the basketball on paper, and all of a sudden you're like, the Nuggets, you catch, or I know you did some scouting for the Sonics and Lakers too. This paper gets out there and you start getting calls. You're like, okay, here's general manager, here's coach, whoever, here's how you can use this, and here's how it's going to impact your success on the floor. What's that conversation like to get the buy-in? And what is the data maybe that I'm sure you kept a little bit in your back pocket that you didn't just make fully public that you can use to your advantage? In those early days.
When I first had to sell this, I went around the country. I quit my engineering job. I've got a year and a half of money. Let me go figure out who I can talk to and see what I can do. And fortunately, the Seattle Supersonics, one of the owners, and he was still involved in basketball operations at the time, Wally Walker, was a finance major in college. And so he understood the value of some big picture numbers and basically treating a team as kind of a stock in some ways. And that was one of the ways that I would talk about it is, this is a team whose value you want to increase, whether it's win value or franchise value. And now it's all related to winning. And what are the metrics that kind of drive that? And in the same way, you have a profit loss statement for corporations. There are numbers on the basketball side that can tell you that, can give you a dashboard for what's going well and what's not going well. And it all fits together and wins. I had built that infrastructure, that framework, so that it all linked together. And that was the sales pitch, and it worked very well for the financial people.
Did you have to? Yeah, go ahead.
It was tougher with certainly some of the more traditional basketball brains because their infrastructure, their framework was a player who scores a lot of points is a good player. And for me to say, well, sometimes that's true and sometimes that's not true, that fundamentally clashes with their worldview. And it's difficult to get past that at times. And so you have to deliver that information a little bit differently than I did originally. Was there a common theme? I'm thinking, I keep going back to the, Ellison always talks about MRI imaging on slip discs in the back.
And like, if you go in, it will almost always show like 80% of us have some sort of disc herniation by the letter of the law. And you wouldn't ever known that. And once you tell somebody that, then they become scared to move. They start exercising less. They like it actually leads them down. Was there something that the teams at a fundamental level, common trends, were looking at back in those days that was just like, you guys have this actually all wrong, and it was like kind of accepted as a best practice? That one in the medical field makes me mad, number one, but so it's it's a little less dire in the basketball world. But was there something along those lines where like, guys, you got to actually just reset your whole frame here, and this data and this information will help you?
I think there are a few examples, maybe not completely analogous, but that are kind of close.
Sure.
One is using points as a total metric for evaluating players. It is an okay metric, but it is not perfect. It can definitely lead you into danger. I think another one is what got built in kind of coach world in the 90s was this idea that you have to get back on defense. You have to get back on defense. Nothing else is as important as getting back on defense. And that kind of coach lore, if it works for one very successful team, everybody follows it, even though it may not be the best for everyone. And that's what happened. And you end up with this emphasis on getting back. The pace gets really slow. And frankly, you're not taking advantage of some of the missed opportunities on the offensive side. By getting back on defense, you are ignoring this part about you can get an offensive rebound and score much more easily than you can in the half court. And so just as like this information you're talking about with a slip disc, it can cause you not to exercise, but the cost is you're not exercising. And that is more analogous to what you guys talk about.
So
offensive rebounding.
So kind of like a couple of the players like lagging behind and having that immediate outlet pass. You're like, there's kind of value in that.
Yeah, you can take it's, and so we have emphasized get back on D, and it's a good message.
Of course,
basketball is this dynamic thing where if you're not getting back on defense and you're going to the offensive glass, there is a chance you actually really help the team too. It's this cost and benefit of a lot of actions within the game of basketball.
Right.
That sometimes the message sways too far to one side versus the other.
Yep. And so where was and so that initial message, so you're kind of selling this. Where did you feel personally you made the biggest impact? Was it on coaching decisions in the game, or was it on player acquisitions? Like, we should get this player, they fit. Yeah, I'm sure it was you've probably lived on both sides there, but
yeah, I felt like it was a combination of things. And in a lot of ways, I felt like the education of staff, education of front office staff and coaching staff, of players. I mean, I will talk about just recent stuff. Working with Kristaps Porzingis last year and part of the year prior to that in Washington, he has been incredibly grateful to me for pointing out various things about how to make him better. And these were very specific applications of analytics to the data, but he liked the idea that the stats in many ways are not judgmental. What they are doing is they're identifying things you can do better. He wanted to know why. And so the numbers kind of gave him, when I would give ideas for what he should do to get better, I could tell him why. I could give him some of those numbers. And there were reflections of what he was doing, whether he was fading away from the basket too much, or jumping too far forward, or jumping too far left, these kind of things. Those could come out of the numbers. And I could give him that kind of advice. I'd never try to claim total responsibility for any of the things. He had a great year. He had a very good year. And it was, we worked together very well on that. And I think historically, working with front offices and some of the draft picks we made, I think it was working together. And sometimes, frankly, it was talking people out of making the wrong draft pick too. It's
Yeah.
which doesn't necessarily show up as something as a result, but those kind of things are important.
Yeah, I imagine.
I find this is like with in the NBA, obviously you're dealing with the elite of the elite, right? Like you're dealing with so high level. It's like Rodman studying films. Like he knew where things were going just by studying this, where for us, it doesn't make a difference. But on the elite side, so it's like the health stuff we've talked about, Matt, like genetic tests, like knowing your genome and fine tuning little things about everything can be awesome. But if you don't have the foundations, then why are we going to fine tune? But when you have this awesome, talent and you have the work and you have somebody in front of you, all of those little details can just take you to that next level. Like, I think that's, one of what I'm hearing here. It's pretty fascinating. And
So
then go ahead.
I will interject a little bit on this. So my wife happens to, she works at NIH right now. And so actually
nice.
She had a company that did cancer diagnostics, which is getting exactly what you're talking about. How do you use the genetics that you may have to make better predictions about what is the right treatment for them? So I get to talk to her, and what she's talking about actually has analogies to what I try to do in basketball.
It's great. Like the data, it's crazy, right? Like there's certain things that can make a huge difference for people, but I mean, when you're getting into the nitty gritty of treating things we haven't treated, I mean, I was reading about strep throat. There's a genetic component where they're actually looking at a vaccine for a certain period of people. So my kids are little and they're going through strep throat and here and there. And, when I was little, I had it 3 times and had my tonsils out. Now they don't like to take tonsils out, but there is research that in a certain percentage of people, they will not get rid of it. And those people might benefit from something like a vaccine. So it's like the depth of this data is quite interesting to me.
Yeah, but it has taken a long time to figure out how to work with that data. Yeah,
totally.
I can tell you, some people say, oh, well, in order to solve this problem, we just need more data. Well, a lot of times the problem isn't more data. It is understanding the data that you already have.
Yes.
Or maybe getting this new data, but then combining it with all the rest. And it takes a while to do that, to figure out how to do it. It's not just a matter of knowing what to do in advance, but
and then using the data to then predict the data. Like, okay, like, do you have the foundations? Like 100 ounces of water, check. Protein, check. Exercise, check. If you don't have that, and then you try to do all this other stuff, it might not work. But if you have that, it's just, using data on top of data, I think is pretty fun.
There's the piece.
And I'm saying data's fun. Did you just miss that? I'm getting there.
we had a whole podcast for you.
I'm excited. This is fun.
But it's an interesting thing where you're talking about what you worked with Porzingis, like that's today after you've had probably 15, 20 years of building systems that can distill this data down. And you have probably, I mean, I'd love to go into the, how real time your data is and the dashboards you're looking at that you can drill down on and then share that. But like me and Al were talking, we had a load management for the general population, not for athletes, but we were just talking at a macro level. How hard is like me working in a week with my exercise and just logging on a spreadsheet, just very high level on a 1 through 10, how hard am I working versus how many minutes am I working out, and multiplying those numbers gives me just like a fake stat but I can use that as a benchmark for if I continue logging that for 6 weeks. And it's just measuring my activity level for somebody who's never exercised, getting into something like you would with Porzingis of, hey, you're fading way too much on this baseline versus that one, or you're going left too much here when you had an opening to the right. That macro level has to be set first. And there's data there to support both these umbrella decisions, that lineups, draft picks, players versus, hey, you gotta shoulder fake and do the baby hook here more on this block versus that block. So was there a working through phase where, I guess you said it, the points per game was one of these initial, and going back on defense was just this macro thing. how was that transition? Like, how did you start drilling down more and more to you're working with a player? Like, is there kind of a story of like, all right, we started here, then we got down a little bit more, and we got down a little bit more. I imagine
Yeah,
that's how
yeah,
it
for
went.
sure. I mean, like we kind of, yeah, have told part of the story. Yeah, when I first joined the Sonics, it was about just managing the team possessions, like
Yeah.
recognizing that, oh, our offense is great and our defense is pretty bad, and doing that the right way.
Yeah.
And that is just team level stuff. And then breaking it down to the why. Was it our shooting? Was it our rebounding? Was it turnovers?
Yeah.
Was it getting to the foul line? That's
Yeah.
another layer that I could do 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But there's no way I could have done what I did for KP 20 years ago. The data
Right.
didn't exist. The
Yep.
knowledge of how to use that data didn't exist. The knowledge of how to communicate that data.
So important.
Those three factors, those took, yeah, it was an evolutionary time to figure out. And I won't say that there were no mistakes during that. I mean, that's what you have to do. You have to make some mistakes in communicating some of that data, in translating some of that data.
How
So let me
prevalent?
ask you this,
Go
sorry,
ahead,
good.
Al.
Let
Go
me ask
ahead.
you this question, like from utilizing that data and putting it into practice, right? So, our viewers have heard this a million times, that it takes, 17 years to get 10% of data into practice in medicine. That is what the stat is, right?
Like atrocious.
Like insane,
Yeah.
right? So, and I kind of want to plug this here too, is that there is, imaging in healthcare isn't bad, right? It saved billions of lives, and there's so much positivity to it. But there is, and I don't know the date of this exact study, but there is discussion with regards to imaging on using certain principles when you report the data points to somebody. So they're called the clear principles, which just means you use a consistent language. You note what the epidemiological information is, like, all 6-year-old, like 80% of 6-year-olds have a disc herniation on image. And then you assess the relevance of that finding. Mm-hmm. So, utilizing that, which is just not done routinely right now with regards to musculoskeletal health. That's my expertise, not, anything else. But like, if we could use the data and then report based on the information that we know about this, and not just solely use the data by itself, right? That's your disc herniation. Great, let's treat the disc herniation. Oh, but clinically, it's acting like it's your hip joint. So who cares about this? And the relevance of it, meaning like, is it clinically relevant to your picture? I feel like that's like a lot of what, you're talking about there into my world is, does this data point even matter for what we're talking about? And if it doesn't, how do we utilize it? How do we respect that it's there, but don't get clouded by it and make decisions based on, a data point that might not be relevant right now.
And that is why structure is pretty important. One of the things about a team breakdown, as I say, this is one of the earliest things. It's just, okay, how good are you on offense is based upon just 4 factors. And it is shooting, it is turnovers, it is rebounding, and it is getting to the foul line. But it is, if you say those 4 factors, it sounds like they're all equal. And one of the most important things I felt like I did was make it clear that they are not equal. Shooting is by far the most important of them. It is twice as important as any of the other factors. Turnovers and rebounding are about equal, about half as important as shooting, and then getting to the foul line is least important. And what that structure does is it allows you to ignore certain things, especially like, okay, yeah, they're getting to the foul line a little bit more. That probably doesn't matter that much. It probably is not explaining a significant fraction of why they're better or worse, those kind of things. And so
it might be bright lights on that data point. It still doesn't, like, it might be a very, a high outlier, but still, that's still not the reason.
And
even
I
though
can just see so many scouts and coaches going, man, he really gets to line and puts them in foul trouble. And, like you just somebody focus, and all of a sudden it becomes a narrative that everyone's talking about when they're making decisions. So, this is where,
and sometimes it is right. Can be such an outlier that it becomes that important, but on the team level, it may not be. And then there's this other element about data, is that when you see a piece of data, you don't know necessarily what is causing it. One of the fundamental things that I am working on for book number 2 is this fact that I've been able to study the impact of motivation or emotion, or however you want to characterize it, on players' performance, because we have so much data and we have situations where we know players are motivated or less motivated.
Yeah.
And you can measure that difference between how well they play in those situations. And it's big. So sometimes you look at data and say, oh, he's playing very well, and let's try to understand the mechanics behind it. I can break down all of KP's shooting stuff. But sometimes it's just because they're more motivated versus other times.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
it's a broad thing. And we know that affects us outside of sports a ton as well.
Yeah.
If you are motivated, if you have people who care about you, you're going to work harder. You're going to work smarter.
Yeah. I remember I interned at Villanova basketball operations one summer, and the coach had a kid come up during like the lunch talks and said, like, you got to make 10 layups, and a young kid, like in 30 seconds or something like that. You got to go hard. And then he did it. And then he goes, okay, we're going to do it again. If you do it, I got $100.
Mm-hmm.
And you could see, like, I mean, night and day. So like, you get to the pro level, the magnitude of the game, playoff implications, home court, all of that stuff. Like, it doesn't change that psychology it's just, the magnitude of those motivators must, like, and is that what you mean by the motivation? Like, we really need this game, or else, like, we're going on the road in the playoffs.
There's a lot of different motivators. There's motivators like what you're talking about with regard to the situation. With regard to a little bit of money. And it is funny because in the NBA, you will have, like, post-practice, you'll have situations where that same $100, and like to athletes making millions of dollars, they still want to win that $100. It's funny. But then there's just this element of some of the soft skills. Do you have teammates? Do you have coaches who legitimately care about you? That underlying aspect of motivation is critical too.
Yep. I mean, Allison talks about that one all the time. That's her field,
everybody. I mean, that's everybody. That's human nature, right? I mean, it's like looking at health data, looking at HRV, like heart rate variability is actually probably more linked to how you feel about yourself and what you say to yourself than anything. It's a parasympathetic measure. It's how, how you're resting and taking care of yourself is what this measure shows. So, if you're stressed out, if you had a stressful day at work, if you didn't, if you were down on yourself, or people around you were pissing you off or making you feel like shit, like this HRV gets affected, which then affects your heart rate, which then affects how you feel during the day, which then affects your performance. And it can come all the way down to just talking nice to yourself and being kind, like, versus all this physical activity and you have to do this and this. It's just like, well, why don't you just give yourself a break? And
that's a great story. I'm going to borrow that one.
It's great. It actually, do you know who Mel Robbins is?
No,
She's a motivational speaker. One of my clients was asking me about HRV because it's a data point on Oura rings, and it's a big data point people are looking at. And in the same day this gentleman we were talking about, I was like, I have to research it more. And on one of her podcasts, she was talking about HRV, and she cited this great research article and that was talking about HRV. So I was like, oh, let me go read it. And so I read it, and it was all about self-talk, like all about being kind to yourself is what changes your HRV, which then affects your sleep. And it's this domino effect. It's fascinating. It's really cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, me and Elle go back and forth on like her role here is she's challenging her peers to be better about the way they talk to patients. You know, a lot of the flaws in the healthcare system. Mine is like I'm the general pop. I'm always this is what we should be doing, or this is what I heard somebody say is important, and then I bounce it off somebody like Allison. So I'm always tough on my friends and family of like you guys got to exercise more. You got to take care of your health. You have to do this. But Allison's like, yeah, but you know what? They don't have the support structure. Like they don't have the right coaches saying this. And so there's a dynamic of like accepting the responsibility. But like you said, like you can be as an NBA player, you can think you want all this stuff, championships or accolades or to win, but you put the right coaches that motivate them the right way and talk to them the right way. All of a sudden, like that incremental difference makes all the difference in the world when you're talking skill levels. That distribution curve is so tight that the smallest differences can propel a team and or player.
And
Can I ask you what's your motivational measure for, like, are you, so I just, so it's right. Cause it's it's, well, I'm talking to two data people and I'm going to say
it's not
impossible to measure.
Not
Right.
impossible.
That was
But if
also
that was
was
because we've
also
been
a laugh
talking.
though. That was
What?
also a laugh. That was also a laugh. Like I don't know if I want to give my secrets
I
away.
know. I don't know if I want to say anything is impossible
No,
from the data
I
side, but
can.
like, motivationally, like, we work with a lot of local and, high level athletes that go to D1 schools and professionals that come back and live in the area. And, we are kind of in the midst of developing some sort of like weekly check-in of just like, how are we doing? And I know there's various tools, but is there something you found that tells you if they're motivated? Like, and maybe that's like not even just the sport side of, oh, it's a big game. If we win this, we're going to have home court advantage through the whole playoffs. Or is it like personal life? Like, I just had a baby and I don't want to freaking play in a game tomorrow. I want to be with my wife and my kid. And, like, where are we at?
Yeah, it is. Sports is a special situation where you have performance measures in a lot of different situations.
Mhm.
And yeah, I had multiple ones. So you got it, a couple of them. One is, frankly, we know when a game is effectively over. A team is leading by 20 points with 4 minutes left. It's not going to change. And so what happens if you look at that situation, garbage time, and you look at how well players play, you see the starters get worse. You see the subs get better because they're trying to show that they can play. So there's that difference in motivation at that point. That is a very strong set of data because we have so much of it. And that gives you a certain measure of performance boost or when it's critical time versus garbage time. And that's one of them. But then I worked in Denver. And when I was in Denver, before a season began, our star player Carmelo Anthony said that he wanted to be traded, and so the rumors were coming about on a regular basis of all these trades that could happen involving so many players on a roster. And when you're in that situation where you could be traded any day, you're not exactly motivated yourself. George Karl talked about how difficult it was to get our guys to just be at practice and then get them to work hard. And because everything was swirling around that they may not be there. And finally we made the trade and we got a lot better. And it wasn't because we got significantly better players. I mean, we traded a star. We actually traded away other good players.
Yeah.
And if you break it down and you look at why we got better, it was because the players who stayed with us went from way down here to way up here.
Yeah,
they got better.
That was like Wilson Chandler and those guys. I remember you guys went on a run that year,
and it was crazy difference. And then you hinted at kind of the personal things. There was a situation, and I won't name the player, who I was like, oh, wow, he's gotten a lot worse. What's going on? I could see his play had declined visually. I looked at the numbers. I started breaking them down. I'm like, okay. I was looking at those causal things, like, oh, he's not shooting as well. He's not getting back on defense as much. His usual skill in defending good players has gone down. And I went in to talk to the coach about all of that, and I spelled out, this started about 2 weeks ago, and it was breaking down everything like that. And he stops me midway through and he says, "When do you say this started?" And I said, "About 2 weeks ago." I said, "Well, that's when his girlfriend broke up with him." I was like, okay.
Yeah.
And
Maybe
all of
instead of the regular work day, you know.
it was, all of those studies ended up with very similar values between when they were playing well, between when they were apparently motivated and when they were not. And so that does give us a pretty good idea in basketball, at least, for how much it matters.
Yep. Very cool stuff. So love to like maybe take the last 10, 15 here just to go into your basketball on paper too. Is that what you're going to call it, number one? But kind of what I'd be interested in, one, you have much more data and there's information that has changed, of course. I'd be interested if the rule changes implicate a lot of that too. Which I'm sure they would. But macro level at the league, from what you've seen, like you were one of the first to kind of come in and do all this stuff with analytics. So this was like a little bit of an edge, more information for teams to have. It kind of spread, right? Daryl and Sam Hinkie got into it. Hollinger went to the Grizzlies. Mike Zarin, who I talked to back when you were reviewing my papers back in 2008, he was one of the guys that reviewed them. Everyone was like keeping all this stuff like really close to the chest. I remember listening to Daryl Morey and like Bill Simmons, and you just like wouldn't tell Bill anything. And like Bill was like pressing for like, well, how do you analyze that? And he's like, no, I'm not telling you that, because I feel like it's pretty much spread league wide, right? Like everyone now is working on this foundation. So it's just like, does that level set the field, or like where is it right now where like teams are kind of, what's the next thing? Like, all right, we're all using possession based Dean Oliver basketball on paper stats. We're doing player tracking. We're using college stats to predict how they're going to do in the pros. What is like what has been like the iteration of like to find a competitive edge? Is it health tracking data? Is it psychology testing? Is it like personality traits? Like where is it kind of macro in the league right now?
So first of all, I'll comment on how no one will comment on anything. Commenting on no one commenting. Yeah, Mike Zarin was great. Mike Zarin, as you probably know, has been on a Sloan panel pretty much every year since that thing's been around.
Yeah.
And he always talks about, like, I go up there, I say nothing of substance, and they want me back every year. It's a great thing. So
yeah.
It is funny that way. So yes, there is a fundamental infrastructure framework for studying the game.
Yeah.
You ask what I think the next things are. You named a couple of them. I do think that player health, player psychology are very relevant. I think ways to not only measure them but manage them, because what I did to study kind of motivation doesn't tell you exactly how to manage it. It tells you the impacts of it. It doesn't tell you how to measure a person's motivation at the moment. We don't know how to do that. I think there are ways to do it. I'm fascinated by that kind of thing. And I think all of this kind of fits into player development. And what I would say is building players to be the best versions of themselves, skill-wise, intelligence-wise, all of that kind of fits, is kind of envelops everything that we're talking about. Making them better players, making them better students of the game, having them learn faster, all of that kind of thing. I think there are a number of technologies. I think there are a lot of measurements that we can apply that need to be studied, or you could end up hurting them. And that is kind of one of those basic rules, is you don't want to hurt your players. You don't want to hurt your team. And so, one of the things that I really like to do is be able to test a lot of what we're talking about. Understanding the psychology of players, building their motivation, understanding techniques within the game. Some of the things that I was able to do with Kristaps Porzingis, but across a broader group of players, to know what's actually going to help them, how we measure those things, not just the psychological side, but that jump shot. There
Yeah.
is so much coach speak, a lot of it valid about how to make a guy a better shooter, but that doesn't work for everybody. I mean, as great as Chip England has been as a shooting coach over his famed career,
Yeah.
he hasn't gotten everybody to be better.
Right.
And I think he will talk about even that what he teaches is different depending on who the student is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So basketball on paper too, then.
That is not the title, but I will hold off on
Okay.
releasing what the title.
Okay. So
I'm laughing at the next book because one of my mentors, Craig Levinson, is just he when he referred to like the book, he has a big book called Rehabilitation of the Spine. I think I don't know what edition it is right now, 3 maybe. Somebody said like, I have 2. Is this good? He's like, nope, burn it. He's like, it was important to get to where this new book is, but just burn it. It's over. Like, this is the next step to that. It's not going to be burnt in my mind, but you shouldn't be practicing this stuff anymore. We should be advancing what we know and updating our priors and moving on.
And I think that's true. That's true. If you are on the leading edge, you're going to get some things wrong. Hopefully you did the majority of it right. But in the next version, you're gonna look back and say, yeah, I could have done that a little better.
Yeah. Any sneak peek macro level, like I'm looking at this, like where I went possession based in the very first one to set the framework. Is there a new framework? Is there just a new data set that supplements it? How have you been thinking about this?
I think the framework for understanding players is definitely different. I think I proposed something 20 years ago that to some degree is carried over. But I didn't give out much in the way of details for how I was doing what I did. And as a result, we've ended up with a number of different player metrics that are out there that are frankly fairly black box. They don't tell you a lot of why a player is listed as good or bad. And I have a framework that is very explainable, that can tell you why a player is good, why a player is bad, in incredible detail. And it can tell you whether it's pick and roll defense or pick and roll ball handler, spacing the floor, these kind of things. And understanding that framework, I think will help us evaluate players better and develop them better.
So I think it sounds, I'm sure that, I mean, you hit both, but it feels like the immediate application might be, style of play and fit for a player.
Fit is definitely something that I talk about in the book as well. I finished that chapter last week, so it's really fresh in my mind. And understanding when players fit and how to measure fit. I mean, we talk about measuring performance, and sometimes embedded in that is this element of fit, not how good they are, but they're playing with the right guys. And so how do you separate out what is fit versus what is their own inherent ability? So if you acquire a player and he doesn't fit, he could be a lot worse. And that is it's relevant. I won't say it's the most important thing, but it is definitely relevant.
Dean's like our eighth author we've had, and he's going to be, I think, our first one with multiple books when this one comes out. Do you have an estimated release date, or are you just you're too far?
I'm intending to finish everything by the end of this calendar year, so I am assuming next year sometime.
Very cool. That will be on my hit list. Okay.
And I'll let you know what the real title is.
I won't leak it if you want. Just give me the heads up.
Because basketball on paper.
So
when I was working with a publisher the first time, there was all of this stuff about, okay, what's the title going to be? And I threw that one out from the very beginning. And they let's see if we can come up with something better. And they spent a lot of time trying to come up with something better than basketball on paper, and they couldn't
do it.
It stuck.
Who says data guys can't come up with creative headlines to the market?
I think data science is about being creative a lot of times anyway.
I was just talking about this. Data should unleash creativity, not constrain you to make decisions in a box that, especially in the business side, people will put scenario analysis together and be like, well, because of the probabilities here, we shouldn't do that. And it's like, you didn't even answer half the questions that the data should. So,
Yep.
you know, in business, being a risk taker, I'm sure it's the same in hoops and a little bit on the healthcare side. There's just like, despite the data, you might be an outlier based on your N of 1 case here. Why don't we try it, see the results,
Right.
and then reevaluate? So,
I mean, the data is to help you, right? Like that's like in healthcare too. Like, okay, great, you have all these fancy things, and you have okay, let's use it to help you versus like just I don't know, go off of just that. Like it should be very integrative and with brains behind it and discussion behind it.
I'm really glad you said it. Like that's a quote takeaway. Like data guys, like, yeah, there's stereotype. I've worked enough with the analytics teams to know that like there's just like data people and they just see the data and they don't know how to communicate it, even though they're great at formulating it and structuring it, but they just can't bring it to life. But there's the left right brain connection that I think people excel at it. Definitely.
Yeah, it's important.
Very cool.
Very informative for me. I took a lot away from today. So thank you.
So
for my own physical therapy practice,
I appreciate it. And a lot. Yeah, really good. And I know you mentioned, and I didn't know leading in that this was your last season with the Wiz. So congratulations on yet another stint with another team. And you said the lifestyle, I mean, talk about being built different. I think you've seen it, right? Like coaches, they're built different to handle that lifestyle. And that was like your first stint, like on the bench, huh? You were saying 24/7.
It was 4 years of doing it, and it was a crazy 4 years because COVID was interspersed in there, and not every season kind of felt different from the previous one, for sure. But yeah, I give a ton of credit to the coaches who can do this for years in, years out.
Yeah,
you are going 24/7 for 7 months, if not longer.
Yeah,
and your off season is not exactly downtime. It's an immense amount of work. The responsibility to the players, the responsibilities to for a head coach in particular, communicating throughout the organization is dramatic. And how you get sleep in there. We talked about sleep as part of health. It was not the healthiest sleep life for me. It was not the healthiest life for me. So very cool. I'm just looking at my bottle of water. I'm due to hydrate. It's Hawaii volcanic water. I want to close up. It's like I would think about the old George Carlin bit when you ask everyone, should I drink this water? And they're like, no, like the water's not good. Like your early days before you got into hoops, I'm staying away from tap water. I'm out of the tap water game. Am I making the right? Yeah, I'm like Icelandic, Hawaiian, naturally alkaline water. So what I would recommend you consider is you are drinking a lot of these things out of plastic bottles, and their tap water has certain standards that it has to meet. There are not necessarily taste standards, and those definitely can vary across the country, but it should be fair. It should be healthy, and there are concerns about some of the plastic and being around bottles too, and it sits in a bottle for a long time. You can have other issues. For me, I drink tap water or bottled water. I'm not too concerned about any there, but there are places in this country where the water tastes bad, and I will go to bottled water.
Fair enough.
Utica tap water is supposedly extremely healthy, by the way.
We're upstate New Yorkers.
The minerals and everything, everything involved in the, looking at it is, I used to have a friend who used to like literally fill their gallon water jugs up in Utica to bring them back to school because the tap water is supposedly so good in Utica.
Okay.
Anyway,
I believe.
All right, I'm gonna update my research. It's a nice healthy wrap up. But I appreciate making the time. I love the applications that the data has across the world. Like everybody has been using, in business and health, and of course analytics and coaching and MBA. So I think it will be valuable for our listeners. We appreciate you making the time, and we'll be on the lookout for that TBD named.
Yes.
What is
good to be here, and I will let you know.
All right, Dean Oliver, thank you so much. Everybody, like and subscribe down below, and we'll see you on the next episode. Thanks.
Yep.